James Brown, non-resident fellow at the US Studies Centre, joins me. Let's begin on impeachment. Look, I feel like I and perhaps a lot of others are a broken record on this, James. We keep saying this is, along party lines. That's how it's falling. Is it worth reflecting on how it's been framed in this way and it's being considered that way in the US? Is it because when Donald Trump says people are out to get him, that does strike people as relatively believable because he's so hated by the other side?
Yeah, and that's what the Republican line is on this, that the Democrats refuse to accept that Donald Trump is the legitimate president of the United States, and they've been using every means at their disposal to take him out of office, and that, this really needs to be settled at the ballot box, not through these institutional tricks. Having said that, he's now been impeached this morning. The Chief Justice was there to preside over that ceremony. He becomes one of a very small number of presidents to be impeached. That will stick with him for the rest of his presidency and for the rest of his life. And the president, as we know, is someone who has a bit of a glass jaw when it comes to those sorts of things. So this has not been a victory for Nancy Pelosi. She held back those articles of impeachment, trying to gain some sort of tactical advantage. She didn't get it. There's now a discussion around how the trial will proceed and how many witnesses will be rolled out. But the result is pretty much a foregone conclusion. In 2 weeks' time, we'll see the Republican majority Senate acquit President Trump of these two charges.
It has been interesting to watch the tactics of Nancy Pelosi. I mean, it's hard to see why she would think she had the whip hand in terms of holding out. She's now talking as well about fresh evidence, and that should be allowed in the Senate hearings. But what fresh evidence would she be possibly alluding to?
Well, we've had some testimony and some commentary from one of Rudy Giuliani's associates about a sort of parallel private intelligence mission being run in Ukraine, observing the US ambassador to the Ukraine, potentially tracking her movements. And the allegation is that was done with some sort of collusion with somebody inside the US embassy. It's pretty distasteful stuff, and that's the sort of new evidence that that Nancy Pelosi is talking about being introduced. There are some other key figures they would love to get on the stand who haven't testified yet. John Bolton being the most significant of those. He said he will testify if called. But people like Senator Rand Paul, for example, have said, well, if John Bolton is called, then it's only fair that the Republicans are able to subpoena people like Hunter Biden to the stand, and who knows what sort of evidence that would drag into the discussion.
Yeah, so then we head down that particular rabbit hole. On the Democrat side, I guess the key question right now is you've got this field where there's no clear contender emerging as yet. Do you think that will happen at Iowa after the primaries there? Is that really going to set the scene?
Look, Iowa's probably not the one that's going to set the scene for two reasons. One, it's such a unique process, the Iowa caucuses. I mean, the sort of 1,700 little groups that get together and the way they make their decisions. The result in Iowa is not necessarily transferable to other states. I think you're more likely to see a better indication of who's got momentum when we get to states like South Carolina, which is not that far away. In the Iowa caucuses, you're seeing four candidates: Biden, Sanders, Warren, Buttigieg, clustering around the top. The order they come in will tell us a little bit, but we'll really have to wait to South Carolina to see who emerges from the field.
It seems when you look at all the markets, and the betting markets were a pretty awful indicator at the last US election, so perhaps we put a large asterisk next to this question, James Brown, but Donald Trump is only firming. Is that just sort of human nature when there is no clear opponent, when you say it's him against whomever?
Yeah, look, I was at a talk with Senator Jeff Flake, former Senator Jeff Flake, who left the Republican Party fairly recently. I was listening to him last night, and he was asked this question. And essentially his answer was, Trump didn't win the popular vote. He has to thread a needle through the Electoral College. And right now in the states that really mattered to him in the last election, his support is not strong. So his base remains strong. His numbers haven't moved. The economy is still strong. He's still a very strong candidate. But if the Democrats can rally round a single candidate, whether that's Biden or somebody else, and they're able to appeal to centrist voters, then they can win this election. If the Democrats are split, or if they go with a candidate who is far to the left, a Warren or a Sanders, then they won't win this election and the president will bring it home. And I think that analysis is pretty much spot on.
The second option, I guess, that sort of far left candidate might be the curveball. But if they are split in the primaries, we've seen that before, these sort of tight contests, and then people say, all right, well, it's not our dog in the fight, but we'll get behind them anyway. Wouldn't that be even more the case, given how much Donald Trump is reviled by Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats just want him out. They don't really care who's in there. Anyone will be better. They just want to get rid of the president. There's a number of Republicans that want that too, but it's a very small number. I mean, the president's control of the Republican Party is still enormous. So factors like turnout come into play, factors like the president's support from evangelical groups. They were an enormous asset to him in the last election. We've seen in the last month some significant voices in the evangelical community turning against the president, so we'd be looking to see whether he starts to lose support from those groups. That'll be a key factor in his popularity and ultimately whether he wins or not.
All right, well, 2020 beginning to shape up. Just finally wanted to ask you about the future submarines project in Australia. Look, it feels as though business as usual is happening here, because guess what? Delays and cost blowouts. Should we be concerned, though, given the magnitude of what's being spoken about?
We should. This needs to be a top priority for the government in 2020. This is one of the biggest cheques the government will write, not only this year, but this decade. And it's not looking good. Defence projects are always complex and they always run over time and they generally cost more money than expected. This one is an $80 billion project, but the most concerning factor in this report is the acknowledgement that the submarines will be late and that there may be a gap of 3 years, a capability gap. And what that means is that's 3 years where Australia might not have a submarine. It means we're effectively defenceless and we don't have the situational awareness of what's happening in the waters around our country, and that's a problem. One of the things we might need to think about is whether the government needs a minister purely devoted to the naval modernisation of our fleet and accountable for that to make sure that this project gets delivered on time.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, given who knows what the geopolitical situation will be at that gap point. James Brown, really appreciate your thoughts. Speak next week. Thank you.
No worries.